The Nexus Station had always prided itself on being the pinnacle of civilized education in the known galaxy. Floating serenely in the neutral zone between 17 different stellar territories, it housed the children of diplomats, nobles, and other assorted beings who considered themselves several evolutionary steps above the average sentient. The architecture itself seemed to sneer at anything remotely primitive, all flowing curves and crystalline spires that caught starlight and refracted it into patterns so complex they required advanced mathematics just to appreciate properly. Which made it all the more amusing that the station's most prestigious combat theory classroom currently resembled a zoo exhibit, complete with various species gawking at the lone specimen from Sol 3. Professor Veltar adjusted his optical enhancers and surveyed his students with the sort of satisfied expression typically reserved for wine collectors examining a particularly fine vintage. His mantis-like features betrayed nothing, but those who knew him well could detect the slight twitch in his mandibles that indicated barely contained amusement. Today's lesson plan promised to be especially entertaining. Combat, he began, his voice carrying the crisp precision of someone who had never actually been in a real fight, is the art of applying force with maximum efficiency and minimum barbarism. It separates us from the beasts of the outer rim. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the assembled students. They sat in their ergonomically perfect hoverchairs, arranged in ascending rows that provided optimal viewing angles for whatever demonstration was about to unfold. The lighting was precisely calibrated to flatter every species present, a technological marvel that somehow managed to make Zentorian scales gleam while simultaneously bringing out the best in vegan crystalline skin formations. In the third row, Zephyr Kol-Thane preened under the attention-optimized illumination. His Altairian heritage showed in every facet of his translucent blue skin, each surface catching and reflecting light in ways that had probably taken his ancestors millions of years to evolve and him about 30 minutes each morning to perfect with enhancement treatments. At 23 standard years, he represented everything the Altairian hegemony wanted the galaxy to see: sophisticated, elegant, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. His gaze drifted to the back corner of the room, where Quinn Reeves sat with a sort of studied indifference that suggested she was paying attention to everything while appearing to care about nothing. The human female, though at 19, barely past adolescence by his species standards, had been attending classes at Nexus Station for exactly 47 days. Zephyr knew this because he had been counting, waiting for her to do something appropriately primitive and embarrassing, so he could feel justified in his disdain. So far, she had been disappointingly well-behaved. Quinn possessed the sort of unremarkable appearance that most deathworlders seemed to favor: brown hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, skin tan from whatever harsh radiation her homeworld subjected its inhabitants to, and eyes that were an unexceptional shade of green. She wore the standard student uniform like everyone else, though somehow on her it looked more like camouflage than formal wear. Everything about her screamed background character, which Zephyr found personally offensive. How dare she be so aggressively ordinary when he had put so much effort into being spectacular? Now then, Professor Veltar continued, activating the room's holographic display system. Today we will examine the fundamental differences between civilized combat techniques and the crude methods employed by less developed species. The display shimmered to life, showing a series of combat scenarios featuring various galactic species. First came the Zentorians, with their elaborate ritual combat that resembled a deadly dance more than actual fighting. Then the vegans, whose combat style involved complex geometric patterns that were apparently both mathematically elegant and surprisingly effective. Each demonstration was accompanied by appreciative murmurs from the students and detailed commentary from Veltar about the sophisticated philosophies underlying each approach. Notice, the professor said, how each technique reflects the cultural refinement of its practitioners. Combat becomes an art form, a means of personal expression that elevates the participants rather than degrading them. More nods of approval. More self-satisfied smiles. By contrast, Veltar's mandibles clicked with what might have been discussed. Consider the methods employed by Deathworld species. Crude, brutal, effective perhaps, but utterly without elegance or higher purpose. The holographic display shifted to show grainy footage of humans in combat. The editing was clearly designed to emphasize the more violent aspects: blood, broken bones, and the sort of grimly determined expressions that civilized species found deeply disturbing. The footage had that amateur quality that suggested it had been cobbled together from security recordings and combat sports broadcasts, rather than any formal military documentation. Quinn's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She sat a little straighter, her hands resting more deliberately on her desk. To anyone else, the movement would have been imperceptible. Zephyr, who had been watching her with the sort of obsessive attention usually reserved for potential threats or romantic interests, noticed immediately. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective, of course, Veltar continued, clearly warming to his subject. The complete absence of form, the reliance on raw aggression over technique, the utter disregard for the aesthetic dimensions of combat. One might almost call it primitive. That did it. Quinn's left eyebrow rose approximately 2 millimeters, a barely perceptible change that somehow managed to convey volumes about her opinion of the professor's expertise. It was the sort of expression that suggested she was fighting the urge to correct a particularly stupid child who had just announced that fire wasn't hot. Zephyr felt a surge of anticipation. Finally, the Deathworlder was showing some emotion. Perhaps now she would reveal her true nature, probably by jumping up and making some sort of crude outburst that would confirm everyone's preconceptions about her species' lack of self-control. Instead, Quinn simply settled back in her chair and returned her attention to her tablet, apparently finding whatever she was reading more interesting than the professor's lecture. The casual dismissal was somehow more insulting than any outburst could have been. Perhaps, Zephyr said, his voice carrying the sort of cultured modulation that made every word sound like it had been personally crafted by a team of linguistic artisans, our human colleague would care to share her people's perspective on combat philosophy. The classroom fell silent with the sort of anticipatory hush that preceded either spectacular entertainment or spectacular disasters. Professor Veltar's mandibles froze mid-gesture, clearly caught between his desire to see the human embarrass herself and his professional obligation to maintain classroom decorum. Quinn looked up from her tablet with the mild surprise of someone who had just noticed that other people were present. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the expectant faces, before settling on Zephyr with the sort of polite attention one might give to a street performer. "I don't think my perspective would be particularly relevant," she said. Her voice carried a slight accent that suggested she had grown up somewhere with actual weather rather than the climate-controlled environments favored by most civilized worlds. "After all, I'm just a primitive deathworlder." The way she said primitive made it sound like she was quoting something she had heard recently and found mildly amusing. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that perhaps their casual bigotry had been more obvious than they had intended. Zephyr, however, interpreted her response as an invitation to demonstrate his intellectual superiority. He rose from his hover chair with the sort of fluid grace that had probably been choreographed by his personal movement instructors. "Come now," he said, his smile managing to be both patronizing and genuinely friendly. "Surely you must have some insights into your species' approach to physical conflict. After all, Deathworld inhabitants are renowned for their directness in such matters." Quinn regarded him for a moment with the sort of expression usually reserved for interesting, but ultimately harmless insects. "We try not to make it more complicated than it needs to be." "Ah, but that's exactly my point." Zephyr's excitement was genuine now, like a scholar who had just discovered a perfect example to illustrate his thesis. The fundamental difference between civilized and primitive approaches to combat lies in the recognition that conflict can be elevated beyond mere survival instinct. Combat becomes a means of self-expression, a demonstration of cultural sophistication. He began to pace, warming to his subject. His classmates watched with a sort of fascinated attention usually reserved for nature documentaries featuring particularly elaborate mating displays. "Consider the Altairian fighting style," Zephyr continued, his skin beginning to shimmer with excitement. "Each movement follows mathematical principles derived from stellar mechanics. Every technique reflects thousands of years of philosophical development. Combat becomes a form of kinetic poetry, a way of channeling the fundamental forces of the universe through disciplined action." "Sounds inefficient," Quinn observed. The comment landed in the middle of Zephyr's dissertation, like a small asteroid hitting a particularly pretentious space station. The classroom's silence took on a different quality, less anticipatory, more stunned. "I beg your pardon." Zephyr's crystalline features reflected the light in sharp, angry patterns. All that philosophy and mathematical precision, Quinn said, her tone remaining conversationally neutral. It sounds like it would slow you down in an actual fight. The point, Zephyr said, his voice taking on the strained patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow student, is that true combat transcends mere physical confrontation. It becomes an artistic expression, a meeting of minds as much as bodies. Quinn nodded thoughtfully. And how often do your enemies stop to appreciate the artistic merit of your technique before they hit you? A few students actually snorted with suppressed laughter. Professor Veltar's mandibles began clicking with what might have been nervousness or amusement, possibly both. Zephyr's skin patterns shifted to deeper, more aggressive shades of blue. In Altairian body language, this was roughly equivalent to a human's face turning red with embarrassment and anger. Perhaps, he said, his cultured voice developing a slight edge, you would care to demonstrate your species' approach to combat? I confess myself curious about Deathworld techniques. Quinn looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was making some sort of internal calculation. When she finally spoke, her tone remained pleasant and conversational. I don't think that would be a good idea. Why not? Zephyr's smile was becoming increasingly forced. Afraid to show us how real warriors fight. The word warriors came out dripping with irony, as if he were putting air quotes around a concept too primitive for his sophisticated vocabulary. Quinn sighed, not dramatically, but with the sort of mild resignation that suggested she had been hoping to avoid this exact situation. Because, she said, you've apparently confused combat with performance art. And I'd rather not embarrass you in front of your friends. The classroom erupted. Not in the violent chaos that might have followed such an exchange on a less civilized world, but in the sort of scandalized whispers and shock gasps that represented the galactic equivalent of throwing down a formal challenge. Several students activated their recording devices, sensing that whatever happened next would be worth preserving for posterity. Zephyr's skin patterns cycled through several shades of blue before settling on something that resembled frozen lightning. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of precise articulation that suggested he was exerting considerable effort to remain civilized. I believe, he said, that we have just witnessed a perfect example of Deathworld arrogance. The assumption that crude brutality is somehow superior to refined technique. He turned to address the class as a whole, transforming the moment into an impromptu lecture. This is precisely what I mean about the fundamental limitations of primitive species. They mistake violence for strength, aggression for skill. They cannot comprehend that true combat requires discipline, training, and most importantly, intelligence. Quinn watched him with a sort of patient expression that suggested she was waiting for him to finish making whatever point he thought he was making. Furthermore, Zephyr continued, clearly building toward some sort of rhetorical climax, the Deathworld approach to conflict resolution inevitably leads to unnecessary destruction and suffering. Civilized species have evolved beyond such crude methods. Are you done? Quinn asked. The question cut through Zephyr's building oratory like a blade through silk. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. Because if you're not actually going to do anything about your hurt feelings, Quinn continued, I'd like to get back to my reading. The insult was so casual, so completely without malice, that it took several seconds for its full impact to register. When it did, the effect was remarkable. Zephyr's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure, revealing something raw and genuinely angry underneath. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to something approaching a growl. You want a demonstration? Professor Veltar, I formally request permission to engage in a controlled sparring exercise with our human colleague. Professor Veltar's mandibles clicked rapidly as he calculated the potential consequences of such an encounter. On one hand, allowing students to engage in actual combat carried obverse risks. On the other hand, the educational value of demonstrating the superiority of civilized fighting techniques over Deathworld brutality was undeniable. The exercise would be strictly controlled, Zephyr added, apparently sensing the professor's hesitation. Safety protocols, medical supervision, the full array of protective measures. Purely for educational purposes. Quinn looked up from her tablet again, her expression suggesting mild curiosity about what new variety of stupidity was about to unfold. I should point out, she said, that I haven't actually agreed to anything. Of course, Zephyr said, his smile returning with predatory intensity. Unless, naturally, you prefer to concede the superiority of civilized combat techniques without demonstration. It was expertly done, the sort of social maneuvering that trapped the opponent between accepting an unwanted challenge or losing face in front of their peers. In more primitive species, such tactics might have led to immediate violence. Among civilized beings, they represented the height of sophisticated manipulation. Quinn considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "All right," she said. The word fell into the silence like a small pebble dropped into a deep well. Everyone waited for the splash, the indication of how far they had all fallen into something they might not be able to climb back out of. Professor Veltar activated the classroom's safety protocols with the sort of nervous efficiency that suggested he was already composing the incident report in his head. Force fields shimmered to life around the central area, creating an improvised arena. Medical sensors came online, ready to detect and respond to any injuries. Emergency medical drones hovered discreetly near the ceiling, their optical arrays focused on the 2 students now facing each other in the center of the room. Zephyr moved with a flowing grace that represented thousands of hours of training in the most sophisticated combat academies in the Altairian hegemony. His stance was perfect, balanced, elegant, and aesthetically pleasing from every angle. Energy coursed along crystalline channels beneath his skin, creating patterns of light that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been potentially lethal. Quinn stood with her hands in her pockets, looking like she was waiting for a bus. "Begin," announced the automated system. Zephyr launched into what could only be described as a masterpiece of kinetic artistry. His movements flowed like water, struck like lightning, and created patterns of light and force that were genuinely beautiful to observe. Each technique was executed with flawless precision, demonstrating years of training and an intuitive understanding of combat mathematics that bordered on genius. Quinn took a step backward, then another. For 30 seconds, she did nothing but move, not elegant evasion or sophisticated defensive techniques, just basic footwork that kept her out of range of Zephyr's increasingly elaborate attacks. To the watching students, it looked like exactly what they had expected. The primitive human overwhelmed by superior technique, reduced to desperate flight in the face of civilized superiority. Zephyr pressed his advantage, his movements becoming more aggressive and spectacular. His skin patterns intensified, creating a light show that would have been impressive even without the accompanying martial artistry. He was, in that moment, everything that Altairian culture aspired to create, elegant, deadly, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority. Which was why he was completely unprepared for what happened next. Quinn stopped moving backward. She didn't transition into some elaborate combat stance or begin her own artistic display of fighting techniques. She simply stopped, planted her feet, and hit Zephyr in the face. The punch was not elegant. It was not mathematically precise. It did not reflect thousands of years of philosophical development or demonstrate any particular artistic sensibility. It was simply a human fist, traveling at an unremarkable velocity, and connecting with Zephyr's jaw with the sort of mundane physics that civilized species preferred to think they had evolved beyond. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Zephyr's elaborate combat flow collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. His beautiful patterns of light flickered and died as his concentration shattered along with several of his teeth. The force of the impact sent him staggering backward, his crystalline features showing spiderweb cracks that leaked luminous fluid down his chest. For a moment, the only sound in the classroom was the quiet hum of medical scanners trying to process data that didn't fit their expected parameters. Then Quinn hit him again. This time it wasn't his face. She stepped inside his guard, which had ceased to exist the moment his artistic sensibilities collided with her fist, and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with a sort of casual precision that suggested she had done this before. Zephyr folded around the impact like origami, his elegant stance transforming into something that resembled a question mark having an existential crisis. He was still trying to process what had happened when Quinn's knee found his chin. The mathematical beauty of Altairian combat philosophy did not account for the possibility that one's opponent might simply ignore all the rules and hit them with blunt objects. Zephyr's training had prepared him for elegant exchanges of technique, sophisticated tactical maneuvers, and the sort of ritualized violence that could be appreciated by experts and aesthetes alike. None of his instructors had apparently considered the possibility that someone might just walk up and punch him in the mouth. Quinn, for her part, seemed to be conducting a brief but comprehensive survey of Zephyr's anatomical weak points. Her movements were not beautiful or particularly sophisticated, but they possessed a brutal efficiency that was somehow more disturbing than overt savagery. Each strike was precisely calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimum effort, not artistic, but undeniably effective. Zephyr went down like expensive architecture in an earthquake, all the more shocking because it had seemed so permanent just moments before. The medical scanners finally found their voice, filling the air with urgent beeping as they detected injuries that their programming had classified as improbable but concerning. Emergency medical drones descended like mechanical vultures, their diagnostic arrays painting Zephyr's prone form in holographic displays that made his condition look even worse than it was. Which was saying something, because it was already pretty bad. Quinn looked down at the defeated Altairian with the sort of mild interest one might show toward an unexpectedly fragile piece of equipment. "How?" she said. The word carried a universe of implications: surprise, disappointment, and a sort of resigned confirmation that her expectations had been met in the most depressing way possible. Professor Veltar's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, frozen in what appeared to be a feedback loop of disbelief. Around the classroom, students sat in stunned silence, their recording devices capturing every detail of what would undoubtedly become the most watched combat footage in Nexus Station history. "The thing about Deathworld combat," Quinn said, apparently addressing the room at large while medical drones fussed over Zephyr's unconscious form, "is that it's not really about fighting. It's about ending fights." She paused, considering her words. "All that philosophy and artistic expression stuff, that's fine if you're putting on a show. But if someone's actually trying to hurt you, you don't have time to make it pretty. You just make it stop." One of the medical drones chirped indignantly as it detected additional fractures in Zephyr's crystalline bone structure. Quinn glanced down at its patient. "He'll be fine," she said, with the sort of casual confidence that suggested she had made similar assessments before. "Nothing that won't heal, though his ego might need more extensive treatment." Professor Veltar finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a mechanical wheeze than actual speech. The medical readings suggest severe trauma to multiple systems. "Surface damage," Quinn said dismissively. "Looks worse than it is because of his fancy light show skin. Mostly just bruises and a few cracked ribs. Maybe a mild concussion." She looked around the classroom, taking in the shocked faces of her classmates. "This is why humans don't usually demonstrate our fighting techniques at parties," she said. "People tend to get the wrong idea about us afterward." The medical drones had begun the delicate process of transporting Zephyr to the station's medical facility. He was still unconscious, which was probably for the best considering the state of his crystalline features. What had once been a symphony of elegant light patterns now resembled a broken stained glass window. "Miss Reeves," Professor Veltar managed, his voice gradually returning to something approaching normal. "Perhaps you could explain what exactly we have just witnessed." Quinn shrugged. He wanted to know about Deathworld combat techniques, so I showed him. That was certainly educational. "Yeah, well, most people prefer the theory to the practical application." She began walking back to her seat, pausing only to collect her tablet from where she had set it down before the demonstration. "For what it's worth," she added, "his technique really was quite pretty. Very artistic. It just wasn't very effective." The understatement hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, filling the silence with the sort of awkward weight that accompanied profound shifts in understanding. As Quinn settled back into her chair and returned her attention to her reading, the other students began to whisper among themselves, not the cruel gossip that had preceded the confrontation, but the sort of nervous chatter that followed genuine surprise. Several of them were already accessing their personal networks, probably researching whatever they could find about actual human combat capabilities rather than the sanitized propaganda they had been fed. Professor Veltar stood in the center of his transformed classroom, surrounded by medical equipment and the lingering smell of ozone from damaged force fields, trying to figure out how to salvage his lesson plan from the wreckage of his preconceptions. "Class dismissed," he said finally. The students filed out in unusual quiet, many of them stealing glances at Quinn, who remained absorbed in her tablet as if nothing particularly interesting had happened. A few of the braver ones lingered near her desk, apparently working up the courage to ask questions, but something in her expression suggested that she had already returned her attention to more important matters. In the medical bay 3 levels down, Zephyr Kol-Thane was beginning his slow return to consciousness. The first thing he noticed was that everything hurt. The second thing he noticed was that his beautiful crystalline features were encased in regenerative medical mesh that made him look like an expensive sculpture someone had tried to repair with duct tape. The third thing he noticed was the medical drone hovering beside his bed, its optical array focused on what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of his injuries. Patient shows signs of consciousness, the drone announced in the cheerfully clinical tone that medical AIs used when delivering bad news. Recommend continued observation for potential neurological complications arising from blunt force trauma to cranial region. Zephyr tried to speak and discovered that his jaw was wired shut. This struck him as unnecessarily humiliating, especially since he was reasonably certain that the human female had pulled her punches. The drone, apparently interpreting his frustrated mumbling as a request for information, activated its holographic display and began showing him detailed scans of his injuries. Patient sustained multiple fractures to facial bone structure, severe bruising to torso region, and minor concussion consistent with impact trauma. Injuries are superficial but numerous, suggesting encounter with opponent possessing superior knowledge of anatomical weak points. The clinical analysis was somehow more insulting than the actual beating had been. Zephyr closed his eyes and tried to pretend that the last hour had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by defective nutrition supplements. It didn't work. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, Professor Veltar was discovering that his carefully planned curriculum had developed some significant gaps. His lecture notes on the superiority of civilized combat techniques suddenly seemed less relevant than they had that morning. His prepared examples of primitive versus sophisticated fighting styles required extensive revision in light of recent evidence. Most problematically, his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cultural development and combat effectiveness had been subjected to what educators euphemistically called field testing. The results had been educational, but not in the way he had intended. Quinn Reeves, oblivious to the philosophical crisis she had precipitated, finished her chapter on xenobiology and began packing her materials. The classroom had emptied except for the cleaning drones that were attempting to restore order to the scattered furniture and damaged equipment. As she headed for the door, she paused to examine one of the diagnostic displays that the medical drones had left behind. The holographic readout showed detailed analysis of the forces involved in the recent altercation, complete with mathematical models that demonstrated the precise application of kinetic energy required to achieve the observed results. She studied the data for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Huh," she said again, apparently satisfied with the scientific accuracy of the measurements. Then she walked out, leaving behind a classroom full of expensive equipment, scattered preconceptions, and the lingering scent of shattered assumptions. 3 hours later, Zephyr Kol-Thane was released from the medical bay with a collection of colorful bruises, extensive cranial reconstruction, and a formal recommendation that he avoid contact sports for the foreseeable future. His friends gathered around him with the sort of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters, eager to hear his account of the encounter. It wasn't a fight, he told them, his voice muffled by medical bandages and wounded pride. It was like being hit by a natural phenomenon, an asteroid with opinions. His audience nodded sympathetically, though several of them were secretly grateful that they had not been the ones to challenge the Deathworld girl to demonstrate her people's approach to conflict resolution. "The worst part," Zephyr continued, "is that I don't think she was even trying very hard." This observation was both accurate and deeply disturbing. The medical analysis had confirmed that Quinn's techniques, while devastatingly effective, had been carefully controlled to cause maximum embarrassment with minimum permanent damage. It was the sort of precise application of force that required not just skill, but a thorough understanding of alien physiology and a genuine desire not to cause serious harm. In other words, she had beaten him up with professional restraint and scientific precision, which was somehow more humiliating than simple brutality would have been. Over the following weeks, Zephyr's encounter with Quinn became something of a legend at Nexus Station. The footage was analyzed by combat theorists, dissected by xenobiologists, and studied by anyone interested in the practical applications of interspecies relations. Several doctoral dissertations were begun on the subject of cultural assumptions and their impact on tactical assessment. Quinn herself remained largely unaware of a newfound celebrity status. She attended her classes, completed her assignments, and maintained the same polite indifference to her surroundings that had characterized her behavior since arriving at the station. The only noticeable change was that other students no longer made casual jokes about primitive deathworlders in her presence. Professor Veltar, meanwhile, had begun the delicate process of revising his entire curriculum. His new lecture series, tentatively titled Practical Applications of Combat Theory in Multispecies Environments, promised to offer a more balanced perspective on the relationship between cultural sophistication and tactical effectiveness. The first lesson, he had decided, would focus on the importance of understanding one's opponent before engaging in any form of physical confrontation. It seemed like a reasonable place to start. As for Zephyr, he eventually recovered both his health and his social standing, though his perspective on Deathworld inhabitants had undergone what philosophers might call a paradigm shift. He no longer questioned the combat capabilities of primitive species, having learned through direct experience that there were significant differences between primitive techniques and ineffective ones. He also developed what his friends characterized as an obsessive interest in human martial arts, spending hours studying footage of Earth-based combat sports and military training exercises. This research revealed that Quinn's demonstration had been, as she had suggested, a carefully controlled example designed to minimize actual harm while maximizing educational impact. The realization that he had been on the receiving end of what humans apparently considered a gentle correction was both enlightening and deeply unsettling. 6 months later, when asked about his experience, Zephyr would describe it as the most valuable lesson he had received during his time at Nexus Station. He had learned, he explained, that true sophistication lay not in the complexity of one's techniques, but in the wisdom to know when and how to apply them appropriately. It was a profound philosophical insight that had come at the cost of several facial fractures and a significant blow to his ego, but he considered it a fair trade. After all, some lessons are worth the tuition, even when payment comes in the form of bruises and humiliation. And in the end, perhaps that was the most civilized approach to education of all.